At my husband's will, reading, my daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You're just the past. Take that broken wrench and disappear." I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I quietly returned to the attic they threw me into and uncovered a secret that could change the future of mankind. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now to catch our next jaw-dropping episodes. Under a heavy blanket of snow, the world around Geraldine Morrison seemed to hold its breath. The sky above Montpelier, Vermont, was the color of ash, and the cold gnawed at the skin like a warning. Rows of black umbrellas dotted the cemetery, motionless under the weight of falling snowflakes, as the casket bearing Henry Morrison was lowered into the ground. Geraldine didn't cry, not visibly, not in a way anyone would notice. Her gloved hands rested on the handle of her purse, fingers curled tightly, knuckles pale. She stood alone, her 3 children several feet away, whispering behind a veil of civility. They didn't look at her. They hadn't looked at her all day, not since the reading of the preliminary will had been scheduled. Henry had died quietly in the night just a week ago. 42 years of marriage ended not with screams or sirens, but with the subtle slowing of breath. Geraldine had held his hand, felt the warmth leave his fingers, and whispered a goodbye that went unanswered. Now she stood among strangers dressed like mourners, people who barely knew her husband, but came for the sake of obligation. Geraldine watched the casket disappear into the frozen earth. Snow piled along the edges as if trying to cover it quickly, as if even nature wanted to hurry this chapter along. The moment the priest mumbled the final blessing, her children were already making their way to the black SUV parked at the edge of the cemetery. Geraldine lingered, but no one waited for her. Inside the vehicle, the air was hot, suffocatingly so. The windows fogged and the tension turned dense, claustrophobic. Rachel, the eldest, sat in the passenger seat, her arms folded, jaw tight. Calvin and Sophia, her 2 younger children, flanked her in the back. Geraldine climbed in last, her movements slow, deliberate. The door had barely clicked shut before the bickering began. "He promised me the lakeside land," Rachel hissed. "Dad and I talked about it just last year." "Yeah. Well, he promised me full access to the trust," Calvin shot back. "I was the one helping him with the estate taxes." "Both of you are delusional," Sophia interrupted. "He told me the house would go to whoever stayed close and who was here every week checking on him, not either of you." Geraldine stared out the window as the car began to move, her reflection soft in the glass eyes lost. They weren't talking to her. They weren't asking what she needed, how she was doing, what it was like to wake up to an empty bed after 4 decades. They were negotiating the spoils of a man barely buried. When the SUV stopped in front of the law office on State Street, no one opened the door for her. Geraldine stepped out into the snow alone, brushing flakes from her coat collar with a hand that trembled only slightly. Inside, the scent of old wood and tobacco hung in the air like something fossilized. Mr. Elliot, their family lawyer for over 20 years, greeted them with a practiced smile and a folder too thick to be simple. They filed into the conference room where leather chairs groaned under coats and shifting impatience. Geraldine sat silently, hands folded in her lap, the widow's black veil still pinned to her hat. She didn't speak when her children began interrupting the reading, didn't flinch when Rachel rolled her eyes at the mention of the ranch, didn't react when Calvin muttered something about property taxes. She simply watched Henry's last words unfold in ink and legality. "And to my beloved wife, Geraldine Morrison." Mr. Elliot read, "I leave the cottage loft above the detached garage at our estate on Hanover Hill. It was her sanctuary, her place of peace. May it be hers always." A beat of silence. Then Rachel scoffed. "The loft. That's not even a legal parcel." Calvin leaned forward. "Is that it? What about the main house?" Mr. Elliot adjusted his glasses, continued with the dispassion of a man used to disappointment. "The remainder of the estate, including the primary residence, all financial accounts, vehicles, and land parcels are to be equally divided among the 3 children, Rachel Mitchell, Calvin Morrison, and Sophia Breen." Geraldine felt something inside her flicker. Not quite pain, not quite rage, something colder. She looked at the table at the grain of the polished mahogany. She remembered hosting Thanksgiving dinners on that same property. Remembered Henry falling asleep on the porch swing with a book on his chest. 42 years. Memories stitched into every wall. And now she was being handed a drafty, unfinished loft like a consolation prize. Rachel stood. Well, we'll need to change the locks immediately. No offense, Mom, but the sooner you pack your things, the easier this will be for all of us. No offense, Sophia repeated with a smirk as if that made the knife any less sharp. Calvin didn't even meet her eyes. I'll go tonight, Geraldine said, her voice quiet but resolute. Mr. Elliot raised an eyebrow. You don't have to rush. I'll go tonight, she repeated, rising slowly. Her chair scraped the hardwood with a sound that seemed to echo louder than any shout. Back at the estate, snow continued to fall thick and unforgiving. Geraldine moved through the halls like a ghost, her footsteps barely registering. The photos were gone, the furniture already rearranged. Rachel had wasted no time making the space hers. In the span of hours, Geraldine had gone from matriarch to tenant. Her room, once hers and Henry's, was closed, locked, apparently already claimed. She climbed the narrow steps to the loft above the garage, with her suitcase in one hand and a box of keepsakes in the other. The door creaked. The light inside was dim, filtered through a single window rimmed with frost. The insulation was poor. The paint on the walls peeled like dead skin. The smell of mothballs and forgotten years filled her lungs. But Geraldine didn't cry. She set the box down on the floor and sat on the edge of the cot someone had shoved into the corner. Her bones ached. Her mind buzzed with the memory of her children's voices, their coldness, their entitlement. But even in that aching quiet, there was something else, something unspoken. Henry had left her this space, not the grand home, not the money. This space, this loft. She looked around. The old bookshelf, the dust-covered table, a steamer trunk that hadn't been opened in years. Beneath the decay there was history, memory, secrets. She leaned back against the wall, closed her eyes, and let the silence settle over her. Not the silence of abandonment, the silence before something awakens, something forgotten. Somewhere beneath the layers of dust and betrayal, a different story waited to be unearthed. Under the pale light of late afternoon, Geraldine rolled up the sleeves of her wool sweater and looked around the loft with the tired gaze of someone about to clean up a lifetime she didn't choose. The air was dense with the smell of old wood mothballs and the sharp scent of forgotten things. Dust hung thick in the beams of sunlight slanting through the narrow window. She could see it move with every shift of her breath, like particles of memory waiting to be disturbed. She started with the bookshelf, a sagging, termite-bitten thing leaning against the wall like it had survived a storm. The books were crumbling at the edges, spines bent or bloated from decades of Vermont humidity. She brushed the dust from the top shelf, coughing as clouds swirled into her face. One by one, she placed the books in a box, her gloved hands working with a kind of mechanical detachment. A stack of yellowed newspapers slid off the shelf and onto the floor. The top one read, "Scientist missing. Govd says no foul play." It was dated 1957. Geraldine paused. She hadn't seen that name in years. R. Alvarez. It rang a bell, a faint one buried somewhere behind memories of Henry building the porch of her children, learning to ride bikes in the driveway of quiet Sunday mornings. She folded the paper and placed it aside. As she moved toward the back wall, her foot caught on a warped floorboard. She stumbled, grabbing a cabinet for balance. The force jarred the old wooden thing violently. Its front legs gave out and the entire piece slammed to the ground. The crash echoed in the tiny space like thunder. She crouched, brushing splinters from her skirt, and that's when she saw it. The back panel of the cabinet had cracked open at the seams, and wedged inside was a book wrapped in cracked leather, tied shut with twine so old it fell apart the moment she touched it. Beneath it, half pinned between two slats of wood, was a folded piece of paper stiff with age. Geraldine lifted the book into her lap and opened it gently. The handwriting was precise, disciplined, but foreign Spanish, she realized after scanning a few lines. the name at the top of the first page, Rios Alvarez. She flipped to the center of the book, and her heart began to race. Rough sketches of machinery, cylindrical components, arrows pointing to pressure valves, flow charts labeled Condensador Primario and Energía por Hielo, hand-drawn symbols that resembled blueprints, but for what she couldn't quite tell. Pages were filled with notes and equations, some crossed out, others rewritten hastily. The ink had faded, but not enough to hide the precision. Whatever it wasn't hobby work. This was engineering. Her hands trembled. She set the book aside and unfolded the paper that had been wedged beneath it. It was a larger drawing, creased so many times the lines were beginning to break. A blueprint, no doubt. But this one had a header in another language, German or maybe Russian, and a date 1944. Scribbled along the side margin in English, prototype viability, uncertain in open environment, requires insulated chamber. Geraldine stared at the paper for a long time. Her mouth had gone dry. She didn't know what it meant exactly, but she knew what it felt like, a secret, a dangerous one. She set everything gently on the bed and stood, her knees cracking as she moved to the corner near the dresser. She'd always hated that dresser, ugly brass handles and a tilt to the left that Henry had always promised to fix. She slid it aside now, more out of frustration than curiosity. But when it scraped across the floorboards, she noticed something odd. One of the boards beneath it was cut slightly differently from the others. It had no nails, just a hairline crack at the edge and a slight rise like someone had lifted it before. She reached for the edge and pried it up with her fingertips. It came loose with a dry creak, revealing a shallow cavity beneath the floor. Inside was a box. A metal one, maybe steel rusted around the corners but still solid. It was about the size of a typewriter case with a single dial lock on the front and no keyhole. Geraldine tried to lift it. It was heavier than it looked. When she shook it gently, she heard something shift inside metal against metal, maybe glass. The dial didn't move. It was jammed or intentionally sealed. She placed the box on the bed next to the book and the blueprint and sat down heavily. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from fear exactly, but from the sharp clarity of knowing something had changed. This wasn't just a loft, not just a room they'd thrown her into like a burden to be shelved. This place was hiding something. And somehow she'd just stepped into the middle of it. That night she didn't sleep. The loft creaked around her as the wind pushed snow against the windows. The box remained unopened beside the nightstand. Her fingers ached from trying to turn the dial, but it hadn't budged. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that blueprint again, the coils, the chambers, the scrawled warning in the margin. Somewhere around 2 a.m., she got up to make tea. The water heater in the loft barely worked, but she didn't care. As she waited for it to boil, she moved to the window, pulled aside the curtain, and froze. Across the road just beyond the driveway stood a figure, not moving, not pacing, just standing, watching. The street lamp caught the edge of his coat, long and dark, with a hat pulled low. She squinted, trying to make out his face, but it was too far, and the snow blurred everything. For a second she thought she imagined it. But then he moved. Not toward the house, not away. Just a small shift of posture, like adjusting weight from one foot to another. Her breath fogged the glass. She didn't blink. Then the man turned and disappeared behind the hedge. She stood there another minute, hand trembling against the curtain. Her tea kettle whistled behind her like a scream. The next morning, Geraldine woke up to a knock on the door. She'd barely slept. She peered through the curtain cautiously. A man in a green parka stood below, smiling with a clipboard in hand. "Morning, ma'am. Sorry to bother you. I'm with a local property group, Vermont Heritage Holdings. We're doing surveys on older lots in the area. Wondered if you'd be interested in a cash offer for your home." Geraldine stepped out slowly, arms crossed. "The loft's not for sale." He chuckled. "Oh, of course, of course. I didn't mean to presume. Just, we specialize in historical properties, and this one caught our eye. Beautiful bones. And we understand it's not officially titled." She narrowed her eyes. "What do you know about this property?" He smiled again, that too smooth smile salesmen use when they're lying. "Just some research. Public records, you know. We're offering up to $30,000 in cash, no inspections required." Geraldine raised an eyebrow. "30,000. He nodded. "As is. Quick close. We handle all paperwork." She stared at him for a long moment. "Who sent you?" His smile faltered. "No one in particular. It's just standard outreach." "You can go," she said. He opened his mouth to speak, but something in her eyes made him stop. He turned without another word, heading back to the truck parked near the road. As it pulled away, she noted the license plate had been covered with snow or dirt on purpose. She went back inside, locked the door, and pulled the curtain shut. Then she walked over to the bed, picked up the metal box again, and stared at it. Someone wanted it. Someone knew what was inside, or thought they did, and now they knew she had it. Under the cover of an overcast morning, Geraldine placed the worn leather-bound notebook, the aged blueprint, and a photocopy of the strange design sketches into a tote bag, then zipped her coat to the top. The wind bit through the seams, sharp and impatient, but she moved with calm precision. The loft was no longer just a room filled with dust and discarded memories. It was a puzzle, and she knew better than to leave puzzles unsolved. The University of Vermont campus stretched out before her in quiet slush and frost-covered stone. She walked past red brick buildings and skeletal trees until she found the Applied Physics Department, housed in a narrow building with stained glass windows and a bronze plaque that had long since lost its polish. A receptionist greeted her with polite disinterest until she mentioned the name on the slip of paper she'd found online, Professor Elliot Martin. "Energy systems," Geraldine said simply. "He specializes in alternative thermal physics and low-temperature transfer theory." The woman raised an eyebrow but picked up the phone. 10 minutes later, Geraldine sat in a cramped office, smelling faintly of chalk and burnt coffee. Books were stacked high along every wall, papers cluttered the desk, and the only space left clear was a square patch of sunlight where a ceramic cup sat steaming faintly. Behind the desk, Professor Martin adjusted his glasses and looked at the folder in his hands. She had said little, only that she'd found the items in a family home, and that she believed they might relate to theoretical energy systems. She wanted to understand if they were real, if they mattered. Martin flipped through the first few pages of the notebook, then the blueprint, then back to the notes. His body stiffened. He leaned forward, lips parting slightly. For a moment he didn't blink. "Where did you get this?" "In a house I inherited. A loft, really. Montpellier. This isn't just theory. These are detailed schematics. Refrigerant systems with sub-zero stabilization. There are mentions of crystallized energy storage, something not even perfected now, let alone then." Then Geraldine asked. He looked up. "These annotations, this format, this is pre-1950s. And this name, see here, R. Alvarez." He pulled out a yellowed copy of a conference transcript from a nearby drawer. He presented in 1942, then vanished in 44. No one knew what happened to him. Geraldine felt her breath falter. Who was he? Martin looked at her carefully. He was a theoretical physicist with ties to both American and foreign intelligence agencies. Alvarez worked on wartime thermal systems, exploring refrigeration and portable cold energy storage for field use. People thought he was onto something revolutionary. Then one day he simply disappeared. Rumors said espionage. Others claimed the government buried his work. The truth nobody knows. He tapped the page with his pen. "And now you bring me this." She nodded slowly, eyes locked on the blueprint between them. "So you're telling me this?" She pointed to the diagram was real. "I'm telling you this could be the genesis of an entire branch of cold energy physics. If this is authentic, Geraldine, you're sitting on a piece of lost scientific history." He leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. "Do you understand what this could mean? This design, if viable, could replace lithium batteries, even nuclear fuel in certain capacities. It's compact, clean, and efficient. And if it was buried in a loft in Vermont, someone wanted it hidden." That last word sat heavy between them. Hidden. Geraldine's mind started connecting fragments. Her husband's habit of locking the loft. His refusal to talk about what it used to be. the way he avoided questions whenever she brought up the strange old trunk in the corner. And now this. "What should I do?" she asked finally. "Keep it safe," Martin said, his voice suddenly taut. "And tell no one else. I'd like to scan a few of these pages and run them past a colleague in cryogenic systems strictly off record. But if this gets out—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. By the time she stepped out of the university building, the sky had darkened further. Snow clung to the sidewalks, and the cold nipped at her face, but she barely felt it. Her thoughts buzzed with quiet intensity. The drive back to the loft was long and winding. Geraldine kept checking her mirrors, noticing the same black SUV behind her for several miles. It turned off before she could be sure. Paranoia, maybe. Or not. That night she sat at the small wooden desk in the loft, laying the journal flat in front of her. She began flipping through the pages she hadn't yet explored, the ones filled more with words than diagrams. The handwriting was the same disciplined, narrow strokes, but what startled her was the language. It had switched from Spanish to a mix of English and coded phrases. She spotted coordinates references to copper pipes and test chambers. Then she found it. The name. Dr. Rios Alvarez, Notes of the Cold Core Project. There it was in ink. Undeniable. And beneath it a single line in larger script, final prototype secured at Morrison Loft. Her eyes widened. Morrison. Her last name. Her husband's family. The line was dated 1946. She flipped again, and a photo slipped loose from between the pages. It was aged and curling, but clear enough. Two men stood beside a large cylindrical machine. One of them was unmistakably younger Henry Morrison, his stance, his stubborn mouth, and the other man must have been Alvarez. Geraldine stared at the photo, 1,000 questions running through her. Had Henry known? Had he helped Alvarez hide the work? Or was it someone before him, his father perhaps, who'd concealed the technology? She looked up, suddenly, eyes drawn to the window. The snow on the sill was broken. Someone had been there. She stood, heart pounding, and pressed her face to the glass. In the moonlight just beyond the porch, the snow was marked with clear, deliberate boot prints. They circled around the side of the garage, then disappeared toward the trees. No animal, no accident. Someone had come close, too close, and walked away when they realized she was awake. She stepped back from the window, double-locked the door, then pulled the small revolver from the drawer beneath the bed. It had been Henry's. She hadn't fired it in years, but she knew how it worked. And now, for the first time in her life, she knew what it felt like to guard something truly dangerous. Not out of fear, but out of duty, ChatGPT'd an eye. The notebook had begun to take on a life of its own. Geraldine sat cross-legged on the floor of the loft, the battered journal spread open across a makeshift work table fashioned from 2 milk crates and a broken door she'd pulled from the closet. Her reading glasses slid down the bridge of her nose as her eyes scanned each page, her breath hitching every few lines. The final entries were different, less technical, more frantic. The ink grew darker, the handwriting more rushed. She turned another page. There it was. A diagram labeled Cold Core Chamber, Final Revision. The annotations were thicker here, underlined repeatedly. Independent of fossil fuels, energy retention without combustion, temperature regulation within plus 0.2 degrees C, and then scrawled in a heavier hand, viable substitute for petroleum-based power grids. Geraldine stared at that last line. Her fingers trembled against the brittle paper. This wasn't just a concept. This wasn't some backroom experiment. This was a fully fleshed machine, a machine designed to provide clean, stable energy without a single drop of oil, gas, or coal. A replacement. She leaned back against the dusty wall, the notebook balanced on her knees. If this worked, if Alvarez's cold core ever made it into production, it could upend the world as she knew it. Every industry, every government, every war that had ever been fought over fuel, made irrelevant by what was buried in the ceiling of a garage, and someone had buried it deliberately. She flipped to the very last page, and her heart skipped a beat. Attached with a paperclip was a photograph, faded and curling at the corners but clear. It showed 2 young men standing outside what looked like a military installation, smiling toward the camera. One of them was undoubtedly Rios Alvarez. She recognized the sharp cheekbones, the wire-frame glasses from earlier clippings. But the man beside him, her breath caught. It was Henry, not maybe, not vaguely resembling. It was her husband, 20-something, broad-shouldered, wearing a uniform that looked civilian but had military markings on the sleeve. He had his hand resting on Alvarez's shoulder. The two of them looked comfortable, familiar. Geraldine's mind reeled. Henry had never spoken of working with engineers, let alone scientists. His entire life he'd claimed to be a mechanical repairman who briefly served as a contractor during post-war reconstruction. No stories, no medals, just silence. She stared at the image, a knot forming deep in her stomach. Had he known? Had he helped hide this? Why didn't he ever tell her? Was the loft his gift or his apology? Outside wind hissed across the rooftop, but Geraldine barely noticed. She set the notebook aside and picked up the rotary phone on the desk, fingers dialing with urgency. It rang 3 times before she heard a familiar voice. Martin, he answered groggy. "It's me," she said, her voice tight. "Geraldine Morrison, I need you to listen." There was a rustle on the other end. "Mrs. Morrison, are you all right? I think my husband knew Alvarez. I found a photo of them together. I think he helped hide the cold core." Silence. Then Martin exhaled hard. "Jesus, I want you to do something," she said. "I want this kept quiet. No leaks, no labs. No one else sees those scans you took. And I want you to connect me with someone in federal investigation. Not press, not academia. Someone who can handle classified tech." Martin didn't hesitate. "I know a man in the bureau. Quiet, level-headed. Name's Greg Hudson. I'll make the call." "But Geraldine, why now? Why the urgency?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the window, lifted the curtain an inch, and scanned the darkness beyond the frost-covered glass. Her heart sank. Bootprints again, fresh ones, deep in the snow. They circled the garage, crossed the backyard, moved deliberately around the perimeter. "Because someone was here," she said quietly, "and I don't think they're going to stop." Geraldine hung up and pulled down the blackout curtain she'd kept rolled above the window. She moved silently, checking each lock, deadbolts, chains, the wedge she kept under the door. She turned off every light. But it didn't matter. At 2:47 a.m., the sound of footsteps creaked across the old porch. Not animals, not wind. Footsteps, slow, calculated. Then a tap, barely audible but deliberate against the glass of the front-facing window. She grabbed the revolver, her back pressed to the cold drywall, her eyes fixed on the entrance. Every part of her screamed to run to hide, but instead she took a step forward and whispered beneath her breath, "Try me." A shadow moved past the window again, then silence. And then the door handle twitched. She raised the gun. "Go away," she shouted. The sound of retreating steps. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. Geraldine waited. Minutes passed. 10, 15. When she finally crept toward the door and peeked through the peephole, there was no one. Just blackness and the faint shimmer of snow. But in the corner of the porch, tucked behind an old broom, something glinted. She unlocked the door, gun still raised, and stepped out only far enough to retrieve it. A single brass casing. No note, no bullet, just a reminder. She returned inside and locked the door again, this time jamming a chair beneath the handle. Then she sat on the floor beside the revolver and pulled a wool blanket over her shoulders. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, she called Martin again. "Tell your contact," she said. "I want a meeting. In person. Today." And for the first time in decades, her voice carried something new. It wasn't fear, it was war. ChatGPT'd an eye. The wind shrieked through the trees that bordered the property branches, scratching across the garage roof like fingernails across a coffin. Geraldine had not slept. She hadn't even blinked long enough to pretend. The brass casing was still on the table beside her revolver, a silent warning she refused to ignore. At exactly 3:24 a.m. the sound returned. Not just footsteps movement. Wood creaked beneath weight. Snow crunched outside. She held her breath, pistol raised, standing just out of view of the window. And then the unmistakable sound of someone trying the back door. They weren't being subtle anymore. She moved quickly, quietly. The handle turned once, twice. Locked. A pause. Then a loud thump as a shoulder was thrown into the wood. "Get away from my house!" she shouted, voice slicing through the night. I'm armed. The reply was silence, followed by one more thud, harder this time. She fired a single shot into the ceiling. The impact echoed like thunder, followed by the scurrying of boots in retreat. She raced to the front window just in time to see two figures, one tall, one shorter, running across the snow toward the woods. One of them looked back, their face masked by a scarf, but the glint of fear in their eyes was unmistakable. Geraldine grabbed the phone and dialed 911. Montpellier dispatched. The operator answered. There's been an attempted break-in, she said, voice shaking but firm. Shots fired. I'm alone. I need officers here immediately. She gave the address. 5 minutes later, the cruisers arrived, blue and red lights painting the snow in colors far too bright for the hour. 3 officers cleared the property. They found no one, no vehicle, no footprints past the woods. But what they did find chilled her. Dug into the snow beside the back porch was a set of tire tracks leading in from the woods. Not the road, and in the fresh powder, clear boot prints circled the entire building, pausing by each window and door. The officers asked her to come down to the station to give a full statement. She declined. I'll give it when someone with federal jurisdiction arrives, she said. You'll want to call the FBI. This isn't just about a break-in. The officers exchanged glances, unsure whether to take her seriously or treat her like a frightened old woman. But one look at the revolver still steady in her hand convinced them. After they left, she sat in the middle of the loft, knees drawn up, arms crossed, listening, not just to the creaks of the house, but to the memories swirling in her mind. Rachel, Calvin, Sophia. Each of them had used the phrase in passing over the last year. Mom, what's the deal with that old loft? It's technically unclaimed land, right? Or isn't that garage built outside the original title map? At the time, it had sounded like idle curiosity. Now it felt like foreshadowing. She had thought the threats were from outsiders. But what if they weren't? What if her own children had known or suspected? Had they looked into the loft's history? Had they read the same rumors? Did they believe there was something buried on this land worth stealing? And if so, what would they be willing to do for it? The phone on the wall rang. She nearly jumped. It was Martin. They confirmed it, he said. Who? My contact at the bureau. Agent Hudson. He ran the fingerprints you lifted off the box handle. Well done, by the way. Most people wouldn't have even thought of that, and guess what came up? Tell me. Rios Alvarez. He was real. He worked under a covert branch of the Department of Energy during the final years of World War II. His project was redacted even in internal archives. The only thing they know is the code name Cold Core, and the last known location tied to him was a field site in Vermont. Geraldine's throat tightened. Do they know what happened to him? They think he went rogue, Martin said. There's mention of a breakdown in communication, something about ethical concerns. One memo mentioned that he refused to compromise the safety of the civilian grid. Then he disappeared. No trace, no remains, no final report. So he hid the prototype, and your husband helped him, Martin said, not unkindly. It's the only explanation that fits. Henry must have agreed to keep it hidden, maybe even protect it until the time was right. Geraldine looked around the loft. It no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a vault. I want the box opened, she said. I want to know what's inside. Martin hesitated. I thought the lock was jammed. It is, she replied. But there's a biometric reader beneath the handle. I didn't recognize it at first. It looks like a decorative plate. But when I pressed my thumb to it, it blinked red. When I touched it with a wet cloth, it blinked green for a second. It needs a live print. Martin went silent. You're saying it's still active. I'm saying it's very modern technology for a man who died in the 1940s. He exhaled. I'll come up with Agent Hudson. We'll need to handle this carefully. If that box contains what we think it does, it's not just important. It's volatile. And if someone already knows you have it, they do. Geraldine cut in, and they tried to take it last night. There was a beat of dead air. Then we'll be there by morning. He hung up. She placed the phone down, her fingers lingering on the receiver. For the first time in days, she felt something resembling clarity. The ghosts of this loft weren't just whispers of the past. They were warnings. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the thermos she'd made earlier. It was lukewarm bitter, but it steadied her hands. Across the room, the box sat in shadow, silent, sealed. She stared at it for a long time, and for the first time she whispered its name aloud, Cold Core, and the room seemed to respond in kind, silent waiting, as if holding its breath. ChatGPT deny. The FBI agents arrived in unmarked sedans just before dawn, their breath fogging in the cold Montpellier air as they stepped out onto the snow-covered drive. Geraldine watched them from the narrow loft window, a mug of black coffee steady in her hand. They moved with purpose. 2 men, 1 woman, all dressed in the same unassuming charcoal coats, but their eyes held a sharpness that made her think of wolves who knew exactly where the rabbit was hiding. Agent Greg Hudson introduced himself first. He was older than she expected, with silver at his temples and the kind of voice that held more silence than sound. "Mrs. Morrison," he said after glancing around the room, "we believe your property may contain federal intelligence classified under wartime code." Geraldine gave him a measured look. "You're talking about the Cold Core." Hudson blinked. "That term hasn't been used outside internal archives in over 70 years. How did you know it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the closet, pulled out the steel box, and laid it on the table between them. "Because it's here," she said. "And I don't think the people who buried it meant for it to be forgotten." The next 12 hours unfolded like something from a thriller novel. Evidence was photographed. Surfaces were swabbed, and the loft was scanned for electromagnetic anomalies. Hudson and his team worked with eerie precision, never rushing, never hesitating. Martin arrived shortly after, his demeanor now far more subdued in the presence of federal authority. He barely said a word to her except to squeeze her shoulder gently before stepping aside for the agents. Then the question came. "We'll need you to vacate the premises," Hudson said. Geraldine turned her head slowly. "Why?" "For your safety. The existence of this project, if leaked, could endanger your life. What happened last night wasn't just a random burglary attempt." "I know that," she replied. "I had a gun in my hand when they tried to come in. I fired a shot. I know exactly how real this is." "Then you know why we can't let you stay here." Geraldine stood, walked across the room to the window, and stared out at the naked trees beyond. She felt the weight of decades settle across her back, felt the voice of her husband in the stillness. "I buried my husband not 3 months ago," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "This is the only place he left me. This loft, this cold, broken, uninsulated box in the sky. They took the rest. His memory, his name, the house he built with his bare hands, all of it. So no, Agent Hudson, I won't leave. Not now. Not until I know what he died protecting." Hudson didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, as if conceding to a force he couldn't overrule, the gravity of a woman who had been quiet too long. They set up a remote surveillance system and stationed a car down the street with plainclothes officers inside. She gave them access to the exterior locks, but refused to hand over the box or the notebook. "If you want them," she said, "you'll need a warrant, or my permission, and you don't have either." That night she went to bed with the revolver under her pillow and a fire burning in the iron stove. Snow continued to fall thick and soundless. Somewhere beyond the trees, headlights pulsed once briefly, then vanished. At 3:12 a.m. the smell of smoke woke her. She sat up, disoriented, eyes blurry. The room was dark, but the edges of the window frame glowed orange. It took her a full 2 seconds to understand. The loft was on fire. Flames licked up the outer siding. Heat cracked the glass. Smoke billowed in through the floorboards, thick and fast. She grabbed the steel box, the notebook, and shoved them into the fireproof bag she'd bought just that afternoon. She wrapped herself in the wool blanket from the couch, threw the door open, and staggered down the stairs 2 at a time. The fire roared as it crawled up the side of the garage. Flames danced across the roof like living things. She ran barefoot through the snow, coughing, her legs weak, chest burning. Behind her the loft burned brighter and brighter, glass exploding, wood collapsing. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the structure was beyond saving. The garage survived, barely. The loft was gone, so was everything inside, except what she'd saved, except what she already knew. She sat in the back of an ambulance as EMTs checked her lungs. A reporter from a local news station arrived before dawn. She refused to speak. The fire chief gave a statement instead. An elderly woman survived what appears to be an arson attack. Details are under investigation. By noon, the headlines read, "Vermont widow survives blaze involving wartime intelligence files." Her face appeared in a grainy photo blanket around her shoulders, eyes locked on the horizon behind the flames. The phone started ringing by 2 p.m. Rachel called first. "Mom, are you all right? We just saw the news. That was your place, right?" Geraldine said nothing. "I mean, what were you doing in that loft anyway?" "They said something about files. Classified. Are you involved in something dangerous?" Still she said nothing. "Look, I'm not trying to pry, we're all concerned. If there's something going on, maybe it's time to come home. Stay with one of us until it's sorted." Geraldine stared out the hospital window, the revolver case still clenched in her lap. The line went silent. She ended the call. Calvin called next, then Sophia, then Rachel again. Each conversation was the same. Fake concern, soft questions wrapped in velvet threats, a desire to know masked as love. She didn't say a word to any of them. At 5:42 p.m., she returned to what remained of the property. A crew was already there clearing charred beams. The smell of smoke hung heavy ash still warm beneath the snow. Geraldine stood in the center of it all, the fireproof bag still pressed to her chest. She looked at the burned remains of the loft, and for the first time in days, she smiled, because now it was no longer a secret hidden in the attic. Now the world had seen the flames, and the woman they tried to erase had walked straight out of the fire carrying history in her arms. It was nearly 3 weeks after the fire when Agent Hudson returned to Montpelier this time, not with a team of forensic technicians or armed surveillance, but with a briefcase and a folder stamped with the Department of Energy's seal. He met Geraldine in a quiet office borrowed from the local library, a neutral ground far from the charred remains of her loft. "This is the official report," he said, sliding the folder across the table. After cross-referencing every archived memo lab note and security clearance from the Cold Core project, and after analyzing the documents and materials retrieved from your property, we've confirmed 2 things. Geraldine didn't blink. "Go on." "First, the invention and its theoretical basis belonged to Dr. Rios Alvarez. He was the sole designer, author, and architect. His disappearance was voluntary, his intentions deliberate. He chose to hide his work. Second," Hudson paused, then tapped the folder. "According to the handwritten legal directive, found sealed in the steel box, signed by Dr. Alvarez, witnessed by Henry Morrison, and notarized in 1947, you are the sole legal custodian of his work and intellectual property as his designated successor." Geraldine stared at him unmoved, but her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the table. "You mean I own it?" Hudson nodded. "You own it." The contents of the box had been more than blueprints and wires. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, had been a 1-page hand-signed document, part confession, part instruction, and very much a last will. Alvarez had no family, no heirs, no legal partner, but he had trusted Henry Morrison, and through him, Geraldine. And now the Cold Core belonged to her. It didn't take long for word to spread. Leaks happened. Investors whispered. Tech blogs speculated. By the end of the month, Geraldine received her first legal summons. Rachel, Calvin, and Sophia, her own blood, were suing her. The claim that any discovery made on family property was subject to equal distribution among the heirs of the Morrison estate. They argued that as Henry's children they were entitled to 1/3 shares each. Their lawyers framed it as a question of justice, of inheritance, of fairness. But the court didn't agree. In a hearing that lasted just under 2 hours, a federal judge dismissed the case entirely. The reasoning was clear. The Cold Core project was not Henry Morrison's invention. It had never been declared part of his estate. It had been hidden, not owned, and subsequently transferred through a private agreement that predated the birth of any of the plaintiffs. More importantly, the technology was not land value or found asset. It was intellectual property assigned explicitly to Geraldine in writing. She walked out of that courtroom without so much as a backward glance at the family who had tried to carve her name out of history. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. One journalist even tried to shove a mic under her chin. "Mrs. Morrison, How does it feel to be the owner of what some are calling the most valuable energy prototype in modern history? She didn't answer. She got into the car and closed the door behind her. Later that night, she sat at her dining table alone, the cold core briefcase open beside a teapot and a stack of offers from investors. Dozens of them. Oil companies, green tech startups, foreign conglomerates, defense contractors. But only one envelope stood out. It was plain, cream-colored, no logos, just a name. The Alvarez Initiative, Geneva. Inside was a letter from a woman named Dr. Helena Mirov, head of an international consortium of scientists and policymakers seeking to bring ethical, non-patent-controlled energy solutions to developing countries. Their mission to change the global energy paradigm without turning it into another game of profit-driven dominance. The letter ended simply, "Your story began in secrecy. It doesn't have to end that way." The following week, Geraldine flew to New York and met with Mirov's team in a private conference suite. They laid out a proposal that didn't involve billions in upfront payments or corporate buyouts or aggressive licensing. Instead, it offered joint stewardship. Geraldine would remain the legal custodian of the cold core. The initiative would provide the infrastructure funding and scientific oversight to develop it open source, globally distributed and carefully monitored. The estimated value of the project over 10 years exceeded $14 billion. But more than the money, what struck Geraldine was the tone of the room. Respect. No one interrupted her. No one asked if she was sure she understood what she had. No one spoke to her as if she were an accidental gatekeeper. They treated her like what she was. The woman who had carried the torch of a genius long buried, who had survived betrayal, fire, and silence, and emerged not with vengeance but vision. The next morning she signed the agreement, a co-stewardship model, one that ensured transparency, scientific collaboration, and guaranteed that any proceeds would be directed into renewable energy infrastructure in underserved regions. She kept no more than what she needed, a modest salary, a quiet home, and the final say on every use of Alvarez's legacy. When she returned to Vermont, a journalist stopped her outside the general store. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, "some people say you could have sold the cold core for billions, cashed out, disappeared. Why didn't you?" She looked at him then, at the snowy street behind him. "I didn't survive all of this just to become another version of the people who tried to take it," she said. Then she walked past him, the cold wind biting at her coat, her breath strong in the air. She had not just inherited a machine, she had inherited a choice, and she had chosen right. The morning her name appeared on the front page of the New York Times, Geraldine didn't read it. She placed the folded newspaper gently on the kitchen table next to her tea and stared out the frost-tinted window of her new cottage. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't the Montpelier estate that had once been the stage for so much deception and greed. It was small, quiet. Hers. The headline screamed across the page. 68-year-old widow owns world's most promising clean energy invention. Underneath a photograph, her face captured in half-light, solemn and unsmiling, surrounded by scientists and government officials in Geneva. The story painted her as a modern Marie Curie, as a heroine who rose from ashes literally to command the attention of the world's top physicists. They called her the accidental architect of a new age, but she hadn't built anything. She'd simply refused to let it burn. Later that week, a film crew camped outside her gate for hours. Reporters came from as far as Tokyo and Berlin. A woman from the BBC sent her a handwritten letter asking for an exclusive documentary. One journalist begged, "Just 5 words from you, Mrs. Morrison, anything to inspire our readers." She sent back a single sentence, "Survive long enough to matter." But Geraldine didn't crave applause. The limelight felt like heat from a distant fire, visible but no longer dangerous. Instead, she poured her focus into something real. Within 3 weeks, she founded the Alvarez G Foundation. The name was hers, and Alvarez's 2 people from 2 centuries bonded not by blood or legacy, but by belief. The foundation's dual purpose was radical in its clarity: to support abandoned elders and fund humanitarian energy research that would never be patented or monopolized. Every grant, every lab, every community partner had to agree to a singular clause: no profit-first agenda, period. The launch event was modest, just 40 people in a town hall in Burlington, Vermont. But by the following quarter, the foundation had already funded its first initiative solar infrastructure in a refugee zone outside Aleppo, built by Syrian scientists, trained via satellite classes led by Columbia and MIT professors. One morning, while signing a grant approval for a geothermal pilot in Mongolia, Geraldine received a call she didn't expect. Rachel. She didn't answer. Then Calvin. Then Sophia. She let them all go to voicemail. But 2 days later, she opened the front door to find all 3 of them standing on her porch. Rachel's face was thinner than she remembered. Calvin was wearing the same coat Henry used to wear, and Sophia, normally so poised, was trembling, barely able to hold her bag. They didn't speak at first. Rachel tried. "Mom." Geraldine didn't say a word. "We didn't understand," Calvin said. "We thought you were just being stubborn. We didn't know about Alvarez, about the invention, about Dad's part in all of this." Geraldine looked at them, not with rage, not even with sadness. Just silence. Sophia stepped forward. "We were wrong. We let the will blind us. We acted like vultures." Still, she said nothing. Rachel began to cry. "We're not here to ask for anything," she said. "We know it's too late. But we wanted to say sorry. We've lost our way. We lost you. Maybe forever." Geraldine opened the screen door slowly. The wind carried a dry chill between them. "I'm not angry," she said finally, her voice low. "Anger takes too much out of the soul. I'm just empty where you used to be." They didn't reply. What could they say? She didn't ask them in. They didn't expect her to. Instead, they stepped back, shoulders sagging, and returned to their rental car, the gravel crunching beneath their feet like bones. She watched them go, then closed the door. No slamming, no tears, no closure, just the sound of time finally catching up. But that evening a letter arrived. It was written in blue pen on lined notebook paper, careful but imperfect. "Dear Grandma, I saw you on the news. Everyone at school is talking about the Cold Core, but I told them you're not just a scientist. You're a fighter, like in books, like Harriet Tubman or something. Can I come visit you? I promise I won't ask about the machine or the adults or any of that. I just want to know what it's like to believe in something and not give up. Also, I think I like science. Maybe. Could you teach me something? Love, Emily." Geraldine folded the letter with trembling fingers. Emily, her granddaughter, the only one who hadn't demanded, argued, or sued. Just asked. At precisely 4:03 the next afternoon, Geraldine opened her front door again, and there she was, 14 years old, fuzzy beanie hat, oversized hoodie with a physics pun that read, "May the mass times acceleration be with you." Geraldine stepped aside. Emily stepped in. They sat in the small den beside a wood-burning stove with hot cocoa and a dog-eared copy of the Illustrated History of Physics. Geraldine handed it over like it was a treasure map. "This was mine," she said, "from when I was your age." Emily ran her fingers across the cover, reverent. "What should I learn first?" Geraldine smiled softly, not big, not triumphant, just enough to say, "Finally someone asked the right question. Start with chapter 1, she said, "but don't just read it. Ask it why." Emily opened the book. That evening, as the wind howled and snow tapped gently against the windows, the two sat in quiet conversation, one asking, one answering, both learning. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't revenge. But in that single moment, when Geraldine nodded at the question, "Will you teach me?" it was more than forgiveness. It was legacy. And for the first time since she had climbed into that dusty old attic and found a blueprint that could change the world, she felt like she was home. The pen glided across the page slowly, each stroke deliberate, each word chosen like it mattered. Geraldine sat by the window of her cottage, a wool blanket draped over her shoulders, the late winter sun casting long shadows on the hardwood floor. The notebook in her lap wasn't new. Its leather cover was cracked corners worn soft from decades of pressure. It once belonged to Henry. He had written grocery lists, weather notes, fragments of poems he never finished. But now it was hers. At the top of the page she wrote, "The day I became visible." She paused, then scratched it out. Below it she wrote again, slower this time, "The day I stopped apologizing for existing." And beneath that she began the real entry. "I used to believe I was a background character in other people's lives, my children's lives, my husband's, my neighbors', my country's. I lived quietly, politely, always waiting for someone to tell me I mattered. And then a dead man in a dusty attic left me the future. She wrote until her fingers ached. When the kettle screamed from the kitchen, she didn't move. She let the steam rise, let the journal fill with her breath. Her story, her version of everything the world had gotten wrong. Because now it wasn't the newspapers who told her narrative. Not the scientists. Not the courtrooms. It was her. 2 weeks later, she stood under the lights of the Geneva World Energy Congress in a long navy blue dress and a silver pin shaped like the cold core symbol, 2 swirling circles intersecting at a blue gemstone. The same design had been etched into Alvarez's schematics. A voice echoed through the auditorium. Please welcome the recipient of this year's Global Renewable Visionary Award, Geraldine Morrison. Applause. She stepped onto the stage with a calmness most didn't expect from a woman who had spent the last year dodging lawsuits, media storms, and arson. She didn't speak long, just a few sentences. Some of us carry the future in our hands and never realize it until someone tries to steal it. I didn't invent the cold core, I preserved it. And now I'm handing it forward, not to companies, not to governments, but to every young girl who ever felt invisible. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Later that night, in the hotel suite provided by the Congress, she turned on the television and caught the tail end of a press briefing held by the FBI. The agent spoke crisply into the mic. The group responsible for the break-in and attempted arson at Mrs. Morrison's residence has been identified as Arcline, a covert syndicate operating across borders known for tracking down and stealing classified or lost technological blueprints from the mid-20th century. Their motive was clear: suppress the cold core and sell its intellectual property to the highest bidder before it could become public. Photos flashed on screen. Faces she remembered only in shadows, and fleeting glances, the man who'd offered to buy her property, the figure in the snow, the person who nearly set her life on fire. All of them now indicted, all of them under investigation for espionage, conspiracy, attempted theft of federal property. She didn't feel triumph, only a strange stillness. Truth had a way of evening things out, in time, in silence. The next morning, a journalist from The Atlantic released an editorial titled "The Woman in the Attic Who Carried the Future." It opened with a single line: when historians look back at the turning point for clean energy, they won't point to a government agency or a trillion-dollar corporation. They'll point to a woman who lived alone in a crumbling attic and said, "No, you can't take this from me." Geraldine clipped the article and placed it in a scrapbook next to photos of Emily. Notes from school children who wrote to thank her, and a printout of the solar network launched in Kenya under the Alvarez G Foundation. That evening, back in her Vermont cottage, Emily arrived in her usual flurry of snow boots, mismatched socks, and a spiral notebook half filled with equations. She dropped her bag on the floor and grinned. "Guess what, Grandma?" Geraldine raised an eyebrow. "I built the pressure chamber mock-up for the mini-core. It glowed." Geraldine gestured to the back room, the makeshift lab they'd converted from her late husband's tool shed. Inside, wires, copper coils, plexiglass panels, and a scaled-down version of the cold core reactor, only 15 inches wide, glowing faintly with the same eerie blue pulse that had once been buried beneath the attic floor. Together, they adjusted the coils, reviewed the magnetic rings, calibrated the external field sensors. Emily's eyes were wide with wonder. "I still don't understand how it doesn't burn anything." "It doesn't need to," Geraldine said. "It doesn't fight matter. It invites it." And then slowly she flipped the switch. The blue light brightened, soft but undeniable humming in rhythm like a second heartbeat in the room. It illuminated their faces, one aged and wrinkled, the other young and sharp, full of questions. Neither said anything for a moment. Then Emily whispered, "It's beautiful." Geraldine nodded. So was she, and so was the future. There were no cameras at the cemetery, no reporters, no security team trailing behind, just Geraldine. She stood quietly under a gray sky, one gloved hand resting on a headstone that hadn't changed in over a year. The snow around it was packed firm, undisturbed. Henry Morrison, beloved husband, born 1943, died 2023. She didn't bring flowers, just herself. And a voice that had learned how to carry weight without breaking. "I kept my promise, Henry," she said softly. I didn't let them bury me with you." Her breath fogged in the air. No tears, just the honesty of a woman who had walked through fire and come out with blueprints instead of scars. "I was scared, you know," she continued. "Not of the attic, not of the shadows, of being alone with the truth, of what it would mean to carry it all by myself. But I wasn't really alone, was I?" She took a step back and smiled, not wide, not forced, but real. "You always knew. That's why you left it for me, not in a will, but in a place only I would care enough to clean." The wind answered her brushing against her coat like an old friend. "I'm not finished," she said, turning. "But I thought you'd want to know. I made it count." That afternoon, Geraldine returned to find her landline blinking with 3 missed calls. 2 were from a journalist in Berlin. The 3rd came with a voicemail. "This is Ellen Monroe, producer at Real Voices. We're airing a special on civilian pioneers in energy reform, and we'd be honored to feature your story. We'd like you to speak just for 5 minutes, not as a scientist, but as Geraldine Morrison." She almost deleted the message, but something stopped her. 3 days later, she sat on a soundstage under soft lights. No makeup crew, no script, just a chair, a camera, and a producer with a trembling clipboard. "We're rolling in 3, 2. Geraldine looked into the lens, and for a moment it felt like looking into the eyes of every person who had ever underestimated her. "I'm not an inventor," she began. "I'm not a genius, and I'm not a revenge story." The camera light flickered red, live. "I didn't burn down a legacy. I unearthed one. A legacy that was hidden, dismissed, thought irrelevant because the person preserving it didn't have a title or a boardroom, just dust arthritis and a refusal to die quietly." She paused. "I didn't retaliate. I didn't sue my children or humiliate them. I didn't fight dirty." And then she said it. "I didn't get revenge. I just lived with the value they tried to bury." The room fell silent. The clip aired on primetime television and was viewed over 27 million times in 48 hours. It became the most quoted line on social media that month. Journalists called it the most elegantly brutal thing said in the clean energy space. And then came the letter, delivered not by courier, but by a Navy-uniformed officer who knocked on her door just after sunset. He handed it to her with a slight bow and the words, "From the President, ma'am. He asked me to deliver it personally." She opened the envelope, slowly, careful not to tear the seal bearing the presidential crest. Inside, on official stationery written in neat black ink, was a short but powerful message. "Dear Mrs. Morrison, on behalf of the United States of America, I want to thank you not just for your contribution to clean energy, but for the dignity, restraint, and compassion with which you carried the legacy of Dr. Rios Alvarez. Your name will not only be in scientific journals, it will be in the soul of a better future. With deepest respect, President Charles J. Elmore." Geraldine read it twice, then once more. She placed it inside her journal, not at the front, not on display, but between 2 entries, one about the attic and one about Emily's first prototype, where it belonged. Legacy. In layers. The next month, she made a quiet visit to a building no one had touched in years, the Montpelier Public Library, or what was left of it. The walls were still intact, but the shelves were crooked lights, dim heating broken. There was a half-torn banner still fluttering near the doorway, "Readers Build Real Futures." She remembered walking here when she was 22, newly married, pockets empty, and mind full of impossible ideas. This was where she'd first read about Nikola Tesla, where she'd copied schematics from old patents onto napkins because they couldn't afford photocopies. This building had raised her in ways no person ever had. Now it needed her. Without cameras or ceremony, she wrote a check. $2 million. The only condition, no renaming. No Morrison Hall or Geraldine Wing. Just better lights, better heating, more books. More kids like her looking for a window in a wall of closed doors. Construction began the following week. She came back often sometimes just to sit and listen, to the turning of pages, to the rhythm of small, hopeful footsteps. Emily once found her there watching 2 young girls arguing over who got to read the science encyclopedia first. "Why didn't you name it after you?" she asked. Geraldine smiled, brushing dust from a chair arm. "Because real stories don't need their authors to be loud," she said. "They just need them to be true." And with that they sat side by side in the corner booth where Geraldine had once dreamed of changing the world, and now quietly had. The sun dipped low behind the maple trees of Vermont, casting long golden shadows across the porch where Geraldine sat. The wood beneath her creaked gently as she leaned back in the chair Henry once built, wrapped in a light wool shawl, the kind she always wore on evenings like this, when the wind was warm but whispered of chill just beneath. The notebook rested open on her lap, the same one she had filled page by page over the past year. It was nearly done, nearly full. Her fingers moved slowly now, not from age but from care, as if every word still mattered as much as the first. In the distance, a screen door slapped shut. Quick footsteps padded across gravel. Grandma. She didn't turn immediately. She smiled first because she knew that voice. It was the sound of Hope with sneakers and freckles. Emily came running up the steps, a printed paper clutched in her hand. "I got in," she blurted, nearly out of breath. "I got into MIT's summer physics immersion." Geraldine looked up, her eyes steady. "You're not surprised?" Emily grinned sheepishly. "Okay, maybe not. But I wanted you to be the first to know." She collapsed to her knees in front of the chair, throwing her arms around Geraldine's waist, burying her face in the shawl. "I want to study energy, like you." Geraldine's hand paused on the girl's back. She looked out at the trees for a long moment before replying. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Don't be like me, Emily." Emily froze, confused, pulling back slightly. "Be better." Geraldine finished, eyes softening. "Be bolder. Ask more questions. Never wait for permission to matter." Emily's eyes watered. "I won't." They sat like that for a while, time folding into itself as generations passed the torch, not with ceremony, but with presence. A gust of wind stirred the pages of the notebook, flipping them gently. Geraldine closed it with one hand, holding the moment in silence. From the corner of the porch, the prototype cold core flickered to life in its tiny glass casing. It gave off no heat, just a soft pulse of sapphire light that illuminated their faces like the soul of a secret finally set free. Inside the house, a kettle began to hiss. A page turned. A sparrow landed on the railing, then flitted away. The wind blew again. A final line appeared across the screen, for everyone who was ever forgotten and found their way back to themselves. Then the hum of the cold core, the sound of paper turning, a breath, a whisper of light across the porch. And then silence, stillness, and light,